Mister, will you be my dad, just for today? A little girl's question that changed everything. What happens when a cold-hearted billionaire is stopped mid-complaint by a little girl asking, "Will you be my daddy, just for one day?" Meet Elliot Reed, a man haunted by loss, and Chloe, a child longing for someone to stay. What begins as a simple favor turns into a life-altering journey of healing, love, and a second chance at family. Their bond defies blood and expectations. But can love alone stand against the past? Where are you watching from today? Let us know in the comments. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Soul-Stirring Stories for more unforgettable tales. The coffee shop was buzzing with the usual mid-morning chaos. Espresso machines hissing like angry cats, impatient suits tapping on phones, and jazz music that no one really listened to. At the counter stood Elliot Reed, 6 feet of pressed wool and repressed emotion. He adjusted the cuffs of his perfectly tailored navy suit as if the silk lining could somehow shield him from incompetence. "I asked for still water," he said flatly, his voice like ice over glass. "This is sparkling." The barista, barely 20, blinked down at the receipt, cheeks flushing with panic. I thought you said—" "You thought wrong," Elliot cut in, not unkind but unwavering, like a door that simply wouldn't open. "Now I'm late for a meeting." He placed the bottle back on the counter with surgical precision. Behind him, the line shifted with silent resentment. People muttered, sighed, exchanged glances. But Elliot didn't flinch. Mistakes weren't just errors in his world. They were infections. Small things mattered. A wrong bottle of water meant someone wasn't paying attention, and Elliot Reed had built his entire life around being the man who never missed a detail. Then, just as he turned to leave, a voice, small, high-pitched, and impossible to ignore, cut through the tension like a bell in a storm. "Excuse me, mister. Will you be my daddy? Just for one day?" He froze, blinked once, and slowly turned. The source of the question was a little girl, no older than 6. She had a halo of wild, sun-bleached curls and wore a faded pink hoodie with a juice stain near the collar. Her socks didn't match, one neon green, the other striped orange, and her sneakers looked like they'd run 1,000 playground miles. But it was her eyes that held him still. Huge, ocean blue, and so disarmingly sincere it felt like she could see through every steel wall he'd built around himself. A woman came rushing toward them, breathless and flushed, her blonde hair falling from a loose braid. She wore a wrinkled beige coat, scuffed sneakers, and the kind of exhaustion that couldn't be faked. Bone deep, honest, tired. She knelt beside the girl, placing a firm but gentle hand on her shoulder. "Chloe," she gasped. "Sweetheart, you can't run off like that." The girl, Chloe, didn't look away from Elliot. "But it's for tomorrow," she insisted, voice rising with urgency. "Tomorrow's Daddy Day at school. Everyone's bringing their daddies. I don't have one, so I thought maybe he could help." "I'm so sorry," the woman said, tugging Chloe back a step, her voice flustered and quick. "She just says things sometimes. She doesn't mean—" "Yes, I do," Chloe interrupted, eyes still locked on Elliot's. "I mean it." He didn't know what to say. He had faced down shareholders, media storms, merger collapses, but nothing prepared him for a 6-year-old looking up at him like he was the answer to something. The woman, Lila, as she would later introduce herself, sighed and tried again. "We'll go. We're really sorry. Come on, Chloe." "Wait," Elliot said, almost without thinking. Both of them froze. Lila blinked at him. Chloe smiled. He adjusted his tie unnecessarily, the smallest sign that something inside him had just short-circuited. "Your daughter," he said, his voice quieter now. "What's her name?" "Chloe Monroe," Lila answered cautiously. "I work at the public library in the afternoons. Nights at the diner on 14th. We're not asking for anything, I promise. She just—" her voice cracked. "She misses something she never really had." Elliot looked at Chloe again. She stood beside her mother with the kind of unflinching hope that most adults had long forgotten. She didn't cower. She didn't apologize. She believed, fully, wildly, beautifully, that asking a stranger to be her father for one day wasn't just possible, but reasonable. "What happened to her dad?" Elliot asked before he could stop himself. Lila's shoulders tightened. "He passed. When she was 2. Car crash. She doesn't remember him." The line at the coffee shop had gone completely still now. Even the barista didn't move. But Elliot didn't care. Something strange was happening inside him, a feeling he hadn't recognized in years. Something like gravity. He took a breath. "What time is Daddy Day?" Lila blinked, unsure if she'd heard right. 10 a.m. "But you don't have to." "I'll be there," he said simply. Chloe's face lit up like the sun rising behind storm clouds. "Really?" she whispered. He nodded. "Just for one day." She beamed. Lila stood stunned, clutching her daughter's hand like an anchor in a very surreal sea. Elliot, the man who rarely deviated from his precisely measured schedule, crouched down, creased slacks and all, to meet Chloe's gaze. "You better make a good schedule," he said dryly. "I don't do chaos." Chloe giggled, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, Elliot Reed smiled. A real one. Not the corporate performance, not the media mask. Just a flicker of something human. He walked out of the coffee shop, not with still water, not with his usual detachment, but with a promise he hadn't meant to make. That night, he didn't sleep well. He lay awake in his high-rise penthouse, the silence of his luxury apartment louder than ever. He watched the city blink outside his window, lights scattered like fireflies in a jar. And he kept thinking about that little girl with the mismatched socks who asked him to show up just once when it mattered. He thought about the name she'd written on that imaginary roll, Daddy, and how casually, how trustingly she'd placed it on him. He didn't know why he said yes. Maybe it was the blue in her eyes. Maybe it was the echo of a voice long gone that once called him Dad. Or maybe he was just tired of running from ghosts and hiding behind deals. At exactly 9:42 a.m. the next morning, Elliot sat beside Lila on a small bench outside Chloe's school. He wore dark slacks, a fitted navy sweater, and a tailored white shirt. Casual, by his standards. His hair was neatly combed, watch perfectly in place, but his hands fidgeted just slightly in his lap. "She doesn't really understand what it means. Having a dad," Lila said, breaking the silence. "She was just a baby when he died. But she notices what's missing. Kids always do." Elliot followed her gaze down the sidewalk where Chloe was balancing along the edge of the curb like a circus tightrope walker. Her yellow ribbon was crooked, her backpack bouncing with every hop. She looked like joy bottled in a child's body. "She's bright," he said simply. "She's everything," Lila replied, voice thick with a kind of truth that didn't need decorating. "I don't do kids," Elliot said after a moment, blunt as ever. "I didn't think you did," Lila said, a half-smile playing at her lips. "Which is why I'm still trying to figure out why you said yes." He turned toward her, really looking at her for the first time. She was tired, yes, but underneath that was something solid, something forged by storms. A woman who had weathered more than her share and still stood upright. "I'm trying to figure that out myself," he admitted. Just then, Chloe came running back toward them, out of breath and grinning. "Come on. It's almost time. They said to bring our daddies into the playroom." Elliot rose, adjusting his coat, hesitating only for a second before offering his hand. Chloe grabbed it without hesitation, her tiny fingers wrapping around his with complete trust. Lila followed a few steps behind, watching them walk into the school like they belonged there, like Chloe had always known Elliot and he had always known her. Something soft and trembling tugged in her chest. She didn't believe in miracles, but sometimes all it took was one yes, one stranger, one little voice asking for the impossible, and someone finally brave enough to answer. Elliot Reed stepped into the school like a man entering another planet. The lobby smelled faintly of glue sticks and applesauce, and the air buzzed with the kind of chaotic energy only a room full of children could create. His polished shoes squeaked slightly on the tiled floor as he passed a bulletin board covered in handprint turkeys and crooked letters that spelled, "Happy Fall, Daddies." He hadn't known what to wear. His assistant had tried to offer suggestions. Maybe something less intimidating, sir? But Elliot didn't own anything that didn't look like it belonged in a boardroom or a courtroom. He had finally settled on a navy cashmere sweater over a crisp collared shirt and dark slacks. It was, he supposed, his version of casual. Beside him, Chloe marched confidently down the hall, her backpack bouncing with each step. She looked up at him now and then with a mixture of pride and ownership, like she'd brought a prized show-and-tell item to school. He didn't quite know what to do with that look, but he didn't hate it. When they reached the classroom, a teacher, Ms. Jenkins, he thought, greeted them with an enthusiastic, if slightly bewildered smile. "You must be Mr. Reed. We're so glad you could join us today." "Pleasure," Elliot said with a polite nod, shaking her hand with just the right amount of pressure. He ignored the way several other parents turned to look at him, their gazes lingering. One or two even whispered. Chloe didn't notice. She marched straight into the classroom like she owned the place. "This is my daddy," she announced proudly to no one in particular, "just for today." The room, a bright explosion of colors and cut paper decorations, held at least a dozen other dads. Some in baseball caps and sneakers, others in dad jeans and friendly smiles. Elliot stood out like a sore thumb. Tall, composed, with a presence that practically carried its own gravity. But Chloe didn't care. She grabbed his hand and tugged him toward the first activity station, a cardboard rocket ship covered in tinfoil. "We're building moon bases today," she declared. Elliot blinked. "Moon bases?" "Yeah, with glue and glitter and cotton balls." She grinned up at him. "You don't mind getting messy, right?" He hesitated. "I prefer spreadsheets to slime." Chloe giggled. "You'll be fine." Over the next hour, Elliot found himself doing things he hadn't done since, well, ever. He cut lopsided stars from construction paper. He squeezed glue bottles that refused to cooperate. He even, God help him, ended up with glitter on his slacks. Chloe led him from one station to the next with unrelenting enthusiasm, pausing only to give him pointers. "Don't use too much glitter, just enough to make it sparkle. You hold the scissors like this. No, your rainbow needs more purple." At the Play-Doh table, she molded a tiny family. A little girl, a tall man with square shoulders, and a woman with long yellow hair. "That's us," she whispered, sliding the figures toward him. Elliot stared at the trio, throat tightening. The man was lumpy and had mismatched arms. But he had glasses, just like Elliot's, and the little girl stood right beside him, smiling, with clay eyes. Just as he was about to speak, Ms. Jenkins clapped her hands. "All right, everyone, time for story circle." Chloe grabbed his hand again and pulled him to a cozy rug in the corner, surrounded by beanbags and picture books. The other kids scrambled to sit beside their dads. Some climbed into laps, others leaned against their shoulders. Chloe didn't hesitate. She curled right into Elliot's side and handed him a book with a hand-drawn cover. "My Daddy is a Superhero." "Read it," she whispered. Elliot cleared his throat. The room was quieter now, a kind of reverent hush settling in. His voice, usually reserved for boardroom presentations and earnings calls, softened as he read aloud about capes and secret missions and bedtime stories that could scare away monsters. Halfway through the book, Chloe leaned back against his chest, her voice a murmur only he could hear. "You feel safe," she said, "like a real daddy." He almost dropped the book. The words hit him with a force nothing had in years. He didn't respond, couldn't. He just kept reading, the letters blurring slightly at the edges. At the end of story time, Ms. Jenkins announced a short break before the next activity. Chloe jumped up and ran to show her clay figures to a friend, leaving Elliot momentarily alone. He stood slowly, brushing imaginary lint from his sleeves. That's when he saw Lila. She was standing just outside the classroom door, clutching a to-go coffee cup, her eyes fixed on him. On them. On the way, Chloe had curled into his side like she'd been doing it her whole life. Elliot wasn't a man who startled easily. But the look on Lila's face, wide-eyed, tear-brimmed, stunned and soft all at once, shook him. She raised a hand in a hesitant wave. He nodded. They didn't speak. They didn't have to. When she finally turned to go, Elliot felt something shift inside him, something tectonic, like a glacier moving for the first time in centuries. Later, back in the classroom, Chloe held up a paper crown dotted with glitter and crooked stickers. "You have to wear it," she said, standing on tiptoe to place it on his head. "Do I?" he asked, one brow raised. "Yes, it's the rule." He crouched slightly to let her do it, wincing when a sticker got tangled in his hair. "I have meetings later, you know." "You'll look awesome," she said with absolute confidence. He did not look awesome, he looked ridiculous. But for some reason, he didn't take the crown off. After crafts came a mini obstacle course, then musical chairs. Elliot declined to dance. He drew the line at public humiliation, but he clapped dutifully and even smiled when Chloe took a triumphant bow after winning her round. Eventually, Ms. Jenkins called everyone to the circle rug again. "This time," she said warmly, "each of you will share something about your dad, real or pretend, something that makes you feel happy." The room buzzed with tiny voices. One child said his dad made the best pancakes. Another said his dad could lift her over his head like a superhero. One boy said his dad never missed a game. Then it was Chloe's turn. She stood up slowly, brushing her skirt down nervously, then turned to look at Elliot. He gave her the faintest nod. "My daddy," she began, "takes me on adventures. We walk through cities and look at buildings and pretend we're explorers." A few kids giggled. Chloe kept going. "He wears a cape under his work clothes, and he always checks the closet for monsters. He reads me stories that make me dream, and he laughs when I laugh, even when it's not funny." The room quieted. "And sometimes—" She hesitated, her voice shaking just a little. "Sometimes he shows up, right when I need him, even if it's just for one day." There was a pause so deep it felt like time itself held its breath. Chloe sat down again, inching closer to Elliot, slipping her small hand into his. He held it tightly. Across the room, a dad sniffled. Another rubbed his eyes. Ms. Jenkins dabbed at her cheek with the edge of her sleeve. Elliot stared down at Chloe's hand in his, the weight of it heavier than any deal he'd ever signed. Not burdensome, just real, tangible, alive. He had entered this classroom a visitor, a stand-in, a favor, but somewhere between the paper crowns and crayon superheroes, he had crossed a line he didn't even know existed, and there was no going back. As they walked toward the front of the school, Chloe skipping slightly beside him, Lila waited by the bench outside. She looked up as they approached, a question in her eyes. Before she could speak, Chloe let go of Elliot's hand and threw herself into her mother's arms. "He was perfect," she declared. Lila smiled, brushing a curl from Chloe's face. Then she turned to Elliot. "She's not wrong," she said softly. He gave a short laugh, then looked away. "I don't do kids," he murmured. "I think you do," Lila replied. They stood in silence for a moment. Then Chloe reached for both of their hands, one in each, and tugged. "Can we go get ice cream?" she asked, as if the world hadn't just shifted on its axis. Elliot looked down at her, then at Lila, then back again. "Yes," he said, surprising himself. "Yes, we can." And somehow that simple answer, so ordinary, so human, felt more significant than any yes he had ever said before. The cafe was tucked on the corner of a quiet street just a few blocks from Chloe's school, the kind of place with worn leather booths, crooked table legs, and a chalkboard menu that hadn't changed since the Reagan administration. Elliot Reed had never set foot inside it before, and judging by the way his shoulders tensed as he ducked under the low archway, it was not the sort of establishment he frequented. He looked completely out of place among the chipped mugs and sticky menus. His blazer, he'd swapped his usual suit for something less formal but no less structured, hung neatly on the back of his chair. His shirt was rolled at the cuffs, exposing a watch so precise it might as well have ticked in stock values. Across from him, Lila stirred her coffee, careful, deliberate. She looked better than she had that morning, less hurried, more grounded, but the weariness beneath her eyes hadn't gone away. She watched Chloe, who sat beside her coloring intently on a kid's menu with a pink crayon. Chloe hummed softly to herself, her tongue poking out the corner of her mouth in deep concentration. They hadn't spoken much since leaving the school. Elliot had offered to take them out for lunch. Thank you," he'd said, though he wasn't entirely sure what for. Maybe for letting him in, maybe for breaking something open in him he hadn't realized was still sealed shut. The waitress came by to take their order, and Chloe grinned up at her. "Do you have mac and cheese with the crunchy bits on top?" The woman smiled warmly. "We do now, sweetheart." Lila raised a brow at Elliot. "You didn't have to bring us here." "I wanted to," he said simply. That seemed to quiet whatever protest had been rising in her. She looked out the window, where golden leaves fluttered against the glass, and fell into silence again. "So," Elliot began after a beat, "was she serious about the Tigers?" Lila laughed softly, the sound a little surprised, a little reluctant. "Absolutely. Chloe's imagination doesn't have brakes. I noticed. She once told her entire class her mom was a dragon-slaying knight who saved princesses on the weekend." He tilted his head. "Is that not true?" She smiled again, this time easier, and sipped her coffee. Lunch came quickly. Chloe narrated her entire thought process as she chose which noodle to eat first, which Elliot listened to with the kind of patience that would have stunned anyone who worked with him. He even tried a bite of her mac and cheese at her insistence, made a face and muttered, "It tastes like childhood." Chloe laughed so hard she nearly snorted. When they finished, she pulled out a folded paper from her backpack. "I made this for you," she said, offering it across the table. Elliot took it slowly, unfolding it with careful fingers. The drawing was messy, vibrant, and full of joy. 3 stick figures stood under a giant yellow sun. One tall, one medium, one small, all smiling, all holding hands. Above them, in colorful uneven letters, were the words, "Me, Mommy, and my Daddy." For a long moment, Elliot said nothing. He just stared at the crayon lines like they were a map to somewhere he hadn't dared to imagine in years. Chloe looked up at him, nervous now. "Do you like it?" He cleared his throat, something catching in his chest. "Very much. I drew it after school," she said, "because today was the best day." Lila reached for her water, her hand trembling slightly. She didn't say anything, but Elliot could see the way her eyes shimmered. Then, with a quiet breath, he set the drawing down and folded his hands on the table. "I had a son," he said. The air in the cafe shifted, like the world itself leaned in to listen. Lila's eyes lifted to his. "James. He was 6, just like Chloe." His voice was calm, deliberate, like he was reading from a script he'd never meant to say out loud. "And a wife, Elise. She used to hum while brushing her teeth. I don't know why I remember that." He paused, staring past them, past the window, into a memory no one else could see. "I missed his first-class project, the one where the dads built a volcano or some nonsense. I told him I'd come to the next one. I had a meeting. Always a meeting." Lila didn't interrupt. She just listened. "That morning, Elise begged me to come, said it mattered, but I told her I had a board presentation I couldn't move, so she took him without me." His jaw clenched. "They were hit by a drunk driver 2 blocks from the school." "Oh, Elliot," Lila whispered. "They died instantly." His voice barely broke the surface of the air, and I was too late. I missed everything that mattered. For a long time, no one spoke. Chloe had gone quiet, sensing the weight of the moment. She reached across the table, her small hand sliding onto his. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice soft but sure. Elliot didn't cry. He hadn't cried in years. Not at the funeral, not in the months that followed, not even when he finally packed away James' room. But now, something inside him cracked. Not loud, not dramatic, just a hairline fracture in the dam. "I don't deserve you," he murmured. Chloe tilted her head. "But I picked you anyway." It was that simple, that profound. Lila's fingers brushed his. Not a full grasp, not yet, but a touch, a grounding. She looked at him with something he hadn't felt in years. Not pity, not awe, just presence. "You may have missed those moments then," she said gently, "but you don't have to miss them now." He looked at her, stunned by the grace in her words. "Every child just wants someone who tries," she continued. "She doesn't need perfect. She needs present." Chloe beamed and leaned into him. "You're doing really good." Elliot let out a shaky breath, his hand settling around her back, anchoring her there. Something unspoken passed between the three of them. A tether, invisible but real. Outside, the city continued to move. Cars rushed, people passed, phones buzzed. But inside that small, imperfect cafe, something sacred had formed. Not a contract, not a plan, not even a promise. Just a beginning. The waitress brought the check. Lila reached for it, but Elliot shook his head. "Let me." She opened her mouth to protest, but he met her eyes and said softly, "Please." She let go. As they stepped outside, the wind tugged gently at Chloe's ribbon, pulling it askew. Lila reached to fix it, but Elliot beat her to it. With careful fingers, he adjusted the bow and smoothed her curls. Chloe looked up at him like he'd just hung the moon. "You hungry for dessert?" he asked. "Yes," she shouted. "Ice cream?" Lila added, laughing. "2 scoops?" Chloe grinned. Elliot smiled. 3. They walked down the block together, Chloe in the middle, holding both their hands. She skipped every other step, humming to herself again. And Elliot Reed, a man who once lived only by order and numbers, realized he was suddenly, beautifully, off script. He didn't know what came next. But, for the first time in a very long time, he wanted to find out. 2 days after Elliot wore a glitter-covered crown in a kindergarten classroom and read, "My daddy is a superhero," aloud to a ring of cross-legged 5-year-olds, Lila Monroe was called into the manager's office at the diner. It was barely past her shift's halfway point, and she still had a pen tucked behind her ear and a tray of half-eaten pancakes cooling on the pass line. Dean, her manager, balding, beige, and barely patient, didn't look up when she walked in. He was hunched over the counter, flipping through receipts and jotting numbers on a clipboard with the intensity of someone calculating the fate of nations, not sausage links. "You wanted to see me?" she asked, trying not to read into the fact that he hadn't offered her a seat. Dean didn't look up. "You had lunch here last week." Lila blinked. "I work here. I eat here sometimes." "Not as a customer," he said. "With someone." Her stomach sank. "With Chloe?" Dean's eyes lifted at last. "With Elliot Reed." Her throat tightened. "I didn't know you kept tabs on who I eat with." He gave a dismissive snort. "Customers talk. Employees notice. Someone from upstairs heard. You're sitting across from the guy who owns the building this place leases. That's not a good look." She swallowed hard. "What look is that?" "The kind that says you're working an angle." "I didn't even know who he was until last week," she snapped, heat creeping into her voice. "And even if I did, it's not—" "I don't want drama," Dean cut her off. "But we can't have any conflicts of interest, and frankly, we don't need the attention." She stood there, stunned. "So, you're letting me go?" He didn't meet her eyes. "It's best for everyone." Everyone apparently meant anyone but her. Lila didn't cry. Not there, not in front of Dean and his clipboard. She nodded, stiffly, and walked out, grabbed her bag from the locker room, and left her apron neatly folded on the break table. The sky outside had turned gray with early dusk, and the air was sharp with the scent of fall. Dry leaves, car exhaust, the faint promise of rain. She made her way to the bus stop, sat on the cold metal bench, and clutched Chloe's small hand like it was the only thing tethering her to the ground. They sat in silence. Chloe sensed something was wrong. Lila could feel the way her daughter kept glancing up at her, waiting for her to speak, but she couldn't yet, not without cracking. "Mommy?" Chloe finally whispered. "Are we in trouble?" Lila blinked hard and pulled her daughter close. "No, baby. Not trouble, just tired." Chloe leaned her head against Lila's shoulder, content with the answer even if she didn't understand it. Minutes passed. Then headlights swept the street and a black car pulled up to the curb, sleek, understated, and very much out of place next to the graffiti-tagged shelter and the flickering street lamp. The back door opened before the engine cut. Elliot stepped out. He wore a dark coat, collar turned up against the wind, and moved with purpose. Not haste, not panic, but a calm that felt like steel. Lila looked up, startled. She wiped her face quickly and stood. "What are you doing here?" He didn't answer her, not immediately. Instead, he crouched in front of Chloe, eye level with the little girl, and placed a hand on her shoulder. "No one gets to hurt your mommy," he said, voice low and fierce. "Not while I'm here." Chloe's eyes widened. Then she smiled, wide, sunny, complete, and threw her arms around his neck. He wrapped her in a hug, tight and certain. Lila stood frozen. Her throat ached. "She lost her job," Elliot said, standing again. His eyes met Lila's. "Because of me." And she shook her head. "It's not your fault." "Yes, it is," he said plainly, "and I don't intend to let it stay that way." 2 mornings later, Lila walked through the revolving doors of the Blake Foundation, Elliot's philanthropic arm. It occupied the entire 13th floor of a downtown tower. Polished stone, filtered light, plants that someone clearly remembered to water. There was a warmth to it, beneath the sleek exterior, a quiet hum of purpose. The receptionist greeted her with a smile and led her through a hallway lined with photos of community projects, libraries, housing centers, food drives. Lila felt underdressed and out of place in her thrifted blouse and sensible flats. She still wasn't sure what she was doing here, but then she heard it. The sound of tiny feet pounding down a hallway. "Daddy!" Chloe's voice rang out like a sunbeam. She burst into the room, barreled past 2 potted ferns, and launched herself into Elliot's arms. He caught her easily, lifting her high. "Did you miss me?" "I always miss you," she said matter-of-factly, arms wrapped tightly around his neck. Lila froze, not because of the word daddy, but because of how naturally he answered to it. There was no hesitation, no awkward flinch, just a smile and an embrace, like it had always been that way. He set Chloe down gently, then turned to Lila. "I want you here." She blinked. "Here?" "As my personal assistant. For the foundation." His voice was steady, unrelenting. "I need someone who gives a damn about people. You never stopped giving, even when it cost you." She stared at him. "I don't want charity." "It's not charity," he said. "It's a second chance, for both of us." She looked down at Chloe, who was now digging into the candy dish on the receptionist's desk, oblivious to the adult intensity around her. Then she looked back at Elliot. He wasn't offering her a rescue. He was offering her a place. Maybe not wrapped in safety, but wrapped in respect. She exhaled. Okay. It didn't change everything overnight. Bills still needed paying. Lila still worried about Chloe's asthma and whether the heater in their apartment would survive winter. Elliot still had meetings to take and numbers to analyze and people to disappoint in polished conference rooms. But it was something. It was presence. And presence, it turned out, had power. Elliot began leaving work a little earlier, just 30 minutes at first, then an hour, enough to help Chloe with her coloring books or show her how to fold paper planes. Lila caught herself smiling at him more, not because she was falling, but because something in him had softened. He carried a spare hair tie in his coat pocket now, just in case Chloe lost hers. He stopped by the diner once just to leave a generous tip for the co-workers who hadn't judged Lila. And every night before he left the office, he checked his phone. Not for earnings reports, but for a picture of Chloe's latest crayon masterpiece. One evening, as they were walking home together, Chloe swinging between their arms, she looked up and said, "You know what I love most about Daddy?" Elliot blinked. "What?" "He doesn't forget." He swallowed hard. Lila glanced over, eyes soft. "Neither do I," she said. Not about what had been lost, but about what had been found. They reached the corner where their ways split. His building towering above them, her neighborhood still 2 blocks away. Elliot crouched and kissed Chloe's cheek. "Good night, superstar." She beamed. "Can I call you tomorrow?" "Call me every day," he said, no hesitation. And as they walked away, Chloe skipping ahead, Lila turned and looked back. He was still there, watching. And this time, he didn't walk away first. It was a Friday evening when everything changed. The apartment was dimly lit, the golden glow from the kitchen bulb flickering slightly with age. Outside, the wind whistled down the narrow alley behind their building, rustling trash bags and clattering a loose piece of metal against a railing. Inside, the smell of microwaved soup lingered in the air, while soft jazz played from an old Bluetooth speaker perched on the windowsill. Lila stirred a pot distractedly, her thoughts elsewhere, eyes glancing at the door every few minutes. Elliot had promised to stop by with Chloe's favorite storybook, the one about the dolphin who solved mysteries, and she had already reheated the soup twice. In the living room, Chloe was unusually quiet. She sat, curled in a blanket on the couch, her sketchpad untouched, her usual post-school chattiness gone. Her cheeks were flushed pink, her eyes glassy. Lila finally turned, noticing the stillness. "Sweetheart?" Chloe blinked slowly, then turned her face away. "My tummy hurts." Lila crossed the room in seconds and pressed a palm to her forehead. It was burning. Her heart skipped. "Okay, baby. Okay, lie back. Let me get the thermometer." The reading flashed. 103. Lila tried to stay calm. She'd dealt with fevers before, she knew the steps, but this felt different. Sudden, sharp, and wrapped in something she couldn't quite name. She placed cool cloths on Chloe's head, gave her medicine, called the pediatrician's after-hours line, left a message. The jazz stopped. The room filled with the tick of the wall clock and Chloe's soft, shivering whimpers. 15 minutes later, the buzzer rang. It was Elliot. Lila opened the door, and he stepped in, still in his gray coat, book in one hand, grocery bag in the other. "I brought—" "She's sick." Lila cut him off, her voice thinner than she wanted it to be. "She's burning up." His expression changed instantly. The businessman disappeared. The father surfaced. He dropped everything and moved to Chloe's side, kneeling beside the couch. "Hey, superstar," he said softly. Chloe opened her eyes slightly and managed the faintest smile. "It hurts," she whispered. Elliot's jaw tightened. He reached for her hand, small, limp, damp with sweat, and held it gently. "I've got you." Lila watched as he sat beside her, brushing curls from her forehead, speaking in low tones. He didn't panic. He didn't flinch. He just stayed. But when Chloe whimpered in her sleep, "Don't leave me too, Daddy," he froze. The words hit him like a punch to the chest. He didn't move, didn't breathe. Lila's breath caught in her throat. He bent forward, pressing his forehead to the edge of the couch cushion. For a moment she thought he was praying. But then his shoulders trembled and she realized what she was witnessing. Elliot Reed, collected, composed, unbreakable, was crying. Not the silent tears of someone trying to maintain control, but the kind that cracked open years of carefully buried sorrow. His hand gripped Chloe's tighter, and his other covered his face. He didn't make a sound, but his entire body trembled under the weight of the past and the present colliding. Lila knelt beside him, unsure what to do. She had never seen him like this, never seen anyone like this. It wasn't just grief, it was release. A lifetime of holding back, crumbling in the face of one tiny girl's need. "It's okay," she said, resting a hand lightly on his back. "I wasn't there," he choked. "I wasn't there for James. I was supposed to be. And now, she's sick, and all I can think is, what if—" "No," Lila said firmly, her voice steady now. "You are here. That's what matters. Right now. Here." He looked at her then, eyes red, raw, desperate, and somehow, even through the tears, there was a flicker of something else. Trust. That fragile, aching kind of hope that only exists when someone has finally stopped running. Chloe stirred again. Elliot leaned in and scooped her into his arms, wrapping the blanket tighter around her, rocking her gently. "I'm here," he whispered. "I'm not going anywhere, I promise." He held her through the night. Didn't move, didn't sleep. Lila offered to take over at one point, but he just shook his head. "I want to stay." So she sat nearby, curled in a chair with a blanket, watching them. Watching this man who had once walked into their lives as a stranger now cradle her daughter like she was something sacred, like he had always been meant to protect her. Dawn crept in slowly through the blinds. The fever broke around 5 a.m. Chloe's forehead cooled. Her breathing evened out. Her fingers curled lightly into Elliot's sleeve. When Lila returned from the kitchen with a fresh glass of water, she paused in the doorway. Elliot was still sitting in the rocking chair, Chloe asleep in his lap. His eyes were closed, his face slack with exhaustion, but his arms remained steady around her. His shirt was damp, his cheeks stained with dried tears. He looked both wrecked and whole. Lila set the glass down quietly, not wanting to wake them, but he opened his eyes anyway. Just a little. Their gazes met. Neither said a word. They didn't have to, because something had shifted in that long, silent night. Not with fireworks, not with declarations, but with a fever, a whispered plea, and a man who didn't walk away. Later that day, as Chloe napped in her bed, Lila found herself in the kitchen stirring soup for real this time. Elliot stood beside her, sleeves rolled up, helping cut bread. It was domestic, mundane, shockingly normal, and yet it felt profound. "Thank you," she said. He looked over. "For what?" "For not leaving." He was quiet for a moment, then said, "I almost did. So many times. I'm not good at staying." "You are," she said softly. "Now." He met her eyes and something passed between them, acknowledgement, maybe even forgiveness. Later that evening, Chloe padded into the living room holding her dolphin mystery book. "Can you read to me now?" she asked sleepily. Elliot took the book, scooped her up, and settled onto the couch. She curled into his side, warm and safe. Lila sat nearby, not interfering, just present. Elliot began to read. His voice was gentle, every word measured with affection. He did silly voices for the dolphin characters, made Chloe giggle even through the last traces of fever. When he reached the end, Chloe whispered, "One more page, Daddy?" Elliot smiled and kissed her forehead. Always. And in that moment, everything unsaid was understood. He wasn't a stand-in anymore. He wasn't a temporary fix. He was hers. And maybe, just maybe, he was finally his own again, too. It happened on a Sunday morning, the kind that carried a quiet calm in the air, church bells in the distance, soft footsteps of joggers, the warm scent of fresh bread wafting from the bakery down the street. Lila had just finished brushing Chloe's hair when the knock came. It wasn't hesitant. It was firm, intentional. She glanced at the door, heart tightening. Unexpected visitors didn't happen in their world. Not on Sunday mornings, not at all. "Stay here, baby," she said gently, and Chloe nodded, hopping off the couch to grab her crayons. When Lila opened the door, she froze. A man stood there in a suit too stiff for comfort and a posture too proud for warmth. He looked like a well-pressed warning label. "Daniel," she breathed, her late husband's brother. "I heard," he said without greeting, "about Elliot Reed, the new daddy." Lila swallowed. "It's not like that." He arched an eyebrow. "Really? Because from what I've been told, he's playing house with my niece." Her jaw clenched. "You haven't seen her in years." "I'm here now," he replied smoothly, "which is exactly why I want to change that." He pulled a file from the briefcase tucked under his arm, holding it like a sword. "I'm filing for guardianship." The words hit her like a slap. "You think—" "What? That you can just show up and take her?" she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I think she needs stability," Daniel said, stepping just inside the threshold. "She needs structure, morals, and not from some billionaire with a god complex who decided to cosplay as a father. She has a family," Lila snapped. "With a man who didn't even know her a month ago?" His tone was calm, clinical. "You're not thinking clearly. You're lonely, desperate." She took a step back, shaking her head. "You don't know anything about my life." "I know what's best for her." "No," she whispered. "You don't." From the living room, Chloe's voice rang out. "Mommy, I'm drawing our family." Daniel's jaw twitched. Lila shut the door in his face. The court date came quickly, too quickly. The room was cold, chilled not just by air conditioning but by the weight of everything unsaid. Wood-paneled walls, a raised bench, and the faint echo of rustling papers as the judge scanned the file before him. Lila sat at the front, her hands trembling in her lap. Beside her, Elliot sat straight-backed and silent. He wore a simple navy suit, no tie, not an ounce of arrogance. Just quiet focus, the kind that came from facing storms and deciding to stand still anyway. Chloe sat between them, dressed in a pale yellow dress and holding tightly to Elliot's hand. Her feet dangled above the courtroom floor, too short to reach, but somehow she looked taller than everyone in the room. Across from them, Daniel Marks adjusted his cuffs and stood confidently. "This man," he said, gesturing toward Elliot, "is not family. He is not blood. He is not bound by law or history or name. He is a wealthy distraction, a fantasy built on fairy tales, not reality." The words hung in the air. "I'm her uncle," Daniel continued, "the last living relative on her father's side. I can give her what she truly needs. Roots. Identity. Not the illusion of safety from someone who has known her for, 5 weeks?" Elliot didn't move. The judge turned. "Mr. Reed, do you have anything to say?" He stood slowly. "I never expected to be here," he said. "I never intended to become anyone's father. I didn't plan this. Chloe didn't ask for a fantasy. She asked for someone to show up." He glanced down at her, and she looked back up, unwavering. "I lost my wife and son in a car accident," he continued. "For years, I let that guilt define me. I stopped believing in second chances. Then, Chloe asked me to be her dad, for just one day, and I said yes, just for one day. But the moment I held her hand, I knew something had changed. I wasn't pretending anymore." A silence fell over the room. "I'm not her blood," Elliot added, "but I am her presence, her protector, her bedtime story, her biggest fan. And if that's not family, I don't know what is." Then came a soft sound. A chair creaked. Chloe let go of his hand and stood. She walked to the center of the courtroom, her little yellow shoes tapping gently against the polished floor. The bailiff glanced nervously at the judge, who held up a hand to let her speak. "My name is Chloe Monroe," she said, her voice small but steady. "And I already have a daddy." Gasps echoed behind them. Daniel's face paled. "He reads to me every night," Chloe continued. "He holds my hand when I'm scared. He makes Mommy smile, he listens, and he never makes me feel like I'm not enough." She turned toward Elliot and said simply, "I don't want a new one. I already picked him." Elliot's eyes filled, his breath catching. The judge leaned back slowly and exhaled. In light of the emotional testimony, the demonstrated bond, and the lack of a consistent prior relationship from Mr. Marks, he paused. This court denies the petition for guardianship. Lila gasped, one hand flying to her mouth. Chloe ran back to Elliot and threw her arms around his neck. He lifted her off the ground, holding her close as she buried her face into his shoulder. And, for the first time since that fateful day in a corner store, Elliot Reed did not feel like a man pretending to be a father. He felt like one. Fully. Finally. Forever. The letter came on a Thursday. Cream-colored envelope, no return address, just her name printed in neat block letters across the front. Lila Monroe. She found it wedged between a credit card offer and a coupon flyer, barely noticed it until Chloe pointed it out. "This one looks fancy," she said, tapping the corner. Lila opened it casually, one hand still holding her grocery bags, then froze in the middle of the kitchen. She read it once, then again. Her fingers trembled as her eyes moved over the words a third time. A research institute in Boston, one of the most prestigious in the country. A developmental psychology fellowship she'd applied to years ago, back when dreams were untouched by diapers and double shifts. Before the world turned urgent. Before everything became survival. They had finally replied, and they wanted her. She stood at the window, envelope in hand, the city glittering faintly in the distance. Chloe was in the next room singing off-key to her dolls, completely unaware that the ground beneath their feet had just shifted. When Elliot arrived that evening, arms full of takeout and his ever-present warmth, he saw her before she saw him. Standing in the kitchen, lost in thought, the letter open on the counter beside her. "You got it," he said softly. She turned, startled. "Yeah?" His smile was immediate, genuine. "Lila, that's incredible." She nodded, but her voice was quiet. "I'm not going." His smile faltered. "What?" "It's too far," she said, brushing her hair back. "Chloe's happy here. Her school, her friends, her routine. And you." She stopped herself, looked down. "This life we've been building, it matters more." Elliot crossed the kitchen, stepping close. His voice was gentle but firm. "You don't give up dreams, Lila. You bring them with you." "But what if I lose what we have?" she whispered. He didn't hesitate. He reached out and took her hand, fingers intertwining with hers like it was instinct. "Then it wasn't real enough to begin with," he said. "But I believe it is." She looked up at him, at the man who used to walk through boardrooms like a fortress, the one who now knelt beside Chloe's bed every night to check for monsters. This wasn't the man who once believed love was a distraction. This was the man who had become a lighthouse. Lila didn't say yes. She didn't say anything. She just stepped into him and let herself be held. The following week, Elliot planned something Chloe would later call the best dinner ever. He led them to the rooftop garden of his building, transformed now into something magical. Twinkling fairy lights draped from the pergola, candles flickered along the stone wall, and a small round table sat under the stars, set for 3. Snow lined the edges like powdered sugar. A tiny portable heater warmed the center space, its glow catching in Chloe's curls as she spun around in delight. "Cupcakes!" she squealed, spotting a tray at the far end. "Hold on," Elliot said, laughing. "There's something else first." He gestured to her seat. A small silver box waited on her plate, her name written on top in his handwriting, careful and slightly crooked. "What's this?" she asked, eyes wide. "Open it," he smiled. She did, fingers fumbling with excitement. Inside was a delicate silver necklace, a charm in the shape of a heart, engraved with one word, family. On the back, 2 more, forever. Chloe gasped, clutching it to her chest. "It's for me." "You taught me what family means," Elliot said, kneeling beside her. "And I want you to know, no matter where life takes us, you will always have me." She threw her arms around him, giggling into his coat. "You're my forever daddy now." His voice caught in his throat as he kissed the top of her head. Then he turned to Lila. "I'm not done," he said, rising to his feet. She blinked, unsure what he meant, but he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out another box. "Hannah." He stopped, then smiled gently. "Sorry, Lila." She let out a breathless laugh, already trembling. "You walked into my life like a storm," he said, "and somehow made it a home. You didn't ask for anything and still gave everything. You showed me that family isn't a title, it's a choice." He opened the box. Inside, a simple ring. No diamonds, no fanfare, just something timeless and honest. "I'm not pretending. I don't want temporary. I don't want convenient. I want real." His voice softened to a whisper. "Will you be my family? For real?" Tears spilled down Lila's cheeks. She covered her mouth, nodding again and again. "Yes," she finally choked. He pulled her into his arms. Chloe clapped from behind them. "Can I be the flower girl?" Elliot laughed, still holding Lila. "You're going to be more than that." 6 weeks later, under a pale sky and a chapel filled with white roses, Chloe walked down the aisle in a dress with a sash that sparkled, dropping petals in awkward little clumps and waving to every guest she passed. Elliot stood at the altar in a gray suit, hands only slightly trembling. When Lila appeared, radiant in a simple ivory gown, he forgot how to breathe. The ceremony was small. No grand speeches, no rehearsed vows, just words that had waited a lifetime to be spoken. "I didn't believe in second chances," Elliot said, his voice rough with emotion, "until I met 2 girls who made me want to become someone worth loving." "I thought love meant sacrifice," Lila whispered, "but you showed me it can also mean home." Chloe stood beside them, holding both their hands. As the ceremony ended, Elliot scooped her into his arms and kissed her forehead. "You were the one who chose me first, remember?" he said through tears. Chloe leaned in and whispered, proud and certain, "Best choice I ever made." That night, after the guests had gone and the city had fallen quiet, the 3 of them danced barefoot in the living room. No music, no rhythm, just laughter, mismatched steps, and a joy so pure it made everything else melt away. Lila twirled, laughing, Chloe clutching her skirt. Elliot watched them, hand over his heart, trying to believe this wasn't a dream. He didn't know what the future held. Boston or New York, routines or unknowns. But he knew this. Love wasn't about guarantees. It was about showing up, every day, and never letting go. The snow was falling again. Soft, delicate flakes drifting like feathers in slow motion, dusting the edges of the windows and frosting the sidewalk in a gentle hush. Inside the apartment, laughter echoed off the walls, the kind of laughter that filled space the way music never quite could. Elliot stood at the kitchen island wearing an apron that said, "Head Chef, no refunds," flipping pancakes shaped vaguely like dolphins. Chloe sat on the counter beside him, legs swinging, a bowl of strawberries in her lap. Lila leaned against the doorway, sipping coffee, her eyes crinkled at the corners from smiling. This was their morning now. No longer strangers, no longer cautious steps. They were a family. The shift hadn't happened overnight. It wasn't a single moment. It was 100 small ones layered over time. Morning waffles with slightly burnt edges, bedtime stories where Chloe fell asleep mid-sentence, whispered conversations in the hallway after the world had quieted. Elliot had started leaving work early, not because he needed to, but because he wanted to. Because he'd learned that Chloe's retelling of her day, complete with dramatic sound effects and wrong names for dinosaur species, mattered more than any quarterly report. Because he liked watching Lila fall asleep on the couch mid-movie, her head tilted just slightly, her breathing soft and even. Because he'd built empires before, but never built a home. He now carried a hair tie in his coat pocket. He had memorized Chloe's favorite bedtime songs, even the made-up ones. He knew exactly how many marshmallows she liked in her cocoa. 3, never 4. And on Friday mornings, he walked her to school. She liked to hold his hand, skipping every third step, sometimes humming, sometimes chatting about dreams or math or what her goldfish did when no one was watching. "Do you think fish get bored?" she asked once, squinting up at him. Elliot had smiled. "Only the ones who don't imagine enough." It was a rhythm, a dance, imperfect and beautiful and entirely theirs. But then, one Friday evening, something changed. Chloe came home quieter than usual. She hung up her coat, set down her backpack, and curled up on the couch with a blanket. When Lila offered dinner, she shook her head. When Elliot asked about her day, she just said, "Okay," and went back to staring at nothing in particular. Lila sat beside her, brows furrowed. "Sweetheart, talk to me. What's wrong?" Chloe's voice was barely a whisper. "My tummy hurts." Lila's heart seized. Not again. She placed a hand to her forehead. Warm, but not like before. Still, the worry returned like an old ache. They watched her closely, hovering without hovering. An hour later, Chloe leaned against Elliot, her face pale, eyes dull. He didn't ask questions. He simply lifted her into his arms, settled on the rocking chair in the corner, and held her like something fragile and irreplaceable. "I've got you," he whispered. "You're safe." Chloe let out a whimper in her sleep, shifting slightly, clinging tighter to his shirt. "Don't leave me too, Daddy." Elliot's breath caught. Every muscle in his body stilled. That sentence, those 5 words, cut deeper than he expected, because somewhere in the silent part of his heart, he'd wondered if the ghosts of his past would always make him feel like a fraud. But she didn't see ghosts. She saw him, and he wasn't going anywhere. Not this time. He rocked her gently through the night, not moving even as his limbs went numb. Lila found him like that in the morning, dark circles under his eyes, his shirt damp from Chloe's feverish dreams, but his grip still firm around her. "You didn't sleep?" she whispered. "No," he said, voice hoarse. "Didn't want to let go." Later that weekend, when the fever was gone and Chloe was back to chasing bubbles in the hallway, Lila reached for his hand in the kitchen and held it tight. "You're not pretending," she said. Elliot looked at her. "I never was." He wasn't perfect. He still struggled with soft things, still caught himself trying to measure feelings the way he did risk ratios. But he was here, fully, fearfully, beautifully here. And then came the knock. Sunday morning, mid-pancake. The kind of knock that didn't ask permission, it assumed entry. Elliot opened the door. Daniel Marks stood on the other side, the same rigid posture, the same pressed suit. "I'm not here to argue," he said flatly. "Just here to talk." Elliot didn't answer. Daniel looked past him and saw Chloe chasing a balloon in the hallway, her giggle sharp and bright. "That's not yours," Daniel said quietly. "You understand that, right?" Elliot stepped into the doorway. "She's not a possession." Daniel nodded once. "She's my niece, and I'm still her blood." Elliot's jaw clenched. "Blood is not the same as bond." Daniel narrowed his eyes. "We'll see what the court says." The door closed. 3 weeks later, the courtroom was packed. Not with people, just tension. Heavy, stifling silence. Lila sat between Elliot and Chloe, her hands cold despite the heat from Chloe's small palm. Across the room, Daniel sat upright, expression unreadable. The judge listened. To testimonies, to lawyers, to facts. But then Chloe stood, tiny in stature, immense in presence. She walked to the center, faced the judge, spoke without trembling. "I already have a daddy," she said. She listed what made him so. He read to her. He stayed when she was sick. He didn't just say he loved her, he showed her. And then she turned to Elliot. "I picked him." The courtroom stilled. Lila wept silently. Elliot lowered his head, and the judge, after a long, deliberate pause, spoke. "This court denies the petition for guardianship." Cheers didn't erupt. No clapping, no fanfare, just a quiet exhale from 3 people who finally felt safe again. That night, Elliot held Chloe's drawing, the one she'd made the day he first came to school, faded now, the crayon colors softer, the stick figures slightly smudged. Me, Mommy, my daddy. He looked up from it and found Lila watching him. She walked over, knelt beside him, and placed a gentle hand on his chest. "You've built empires," she whispered, "but this is what you were meant to build." He leaned forward, resting his forehead against hers. Chloe ran in moments later, holding her new necklace, shouting, "Forever family dance time!" They turned on music. They danced. No steps, no routine. Just bare feet on wood floors. Just laughter and arms twirling and hearts wide open. And in the middle of it all, love. Not dramatic, not loud, but steady, present, real. This story reminds us that family isn't always defined by blood. It's defined by presence, by love, and by the quiet choice to show up again and again. Sometimes the most powerful relationships are the ones we never expected, built not through biology, but through kindness, trust, and the courage to stay. Elliot wasn't looking to be a father. Lila wasn't looking to be rescued. And Chloe wasn't trying to change anyone. Yet their paths crossed in a way that transformed all three lives. Through shared moments, some quiet, some chaotic, they discovered that healing doesn't happen in grand gestures. It happens in the bedtime stories, in the pancakes made with too much flour, in holding hands on a hard day, and in staying awake when someone needs you most. We often think love must be earned, or that we're too broken for second chances. But this story proves otherwise. Love is not about being perfect. It's about being present. It's about choosing each other, not once but every single day. Whether you're a parent, a partner, or simply someone who has loved and lost, this story is a beautiful reminder that it's never too late to become the person someone else believes you can be. Now, we'd love to hear from you. Where are you watching from today? Drop your city or country in the comments below. And if this story touched your heart, make sure to like, share, and subscribe to Soul Stirring Stories for more tales that celebrate hope, second chances, and the beauty of everyday love. See you in the next story.